the cathedral would soon be filled with the heavy, cloying scent of white lilies and the quiet, calculating hum of wealthy expectations. But right now, I was 3 miles away, standing in the absolute silence of a deserted bridal suite at the Croft estate. The room was a chaotic testament to privilege and sudden panic. A discarded silk robe lay pooled on the thick Persian carpet, like a shed skin. Expensive silver hairpins were scattered across the polished mahogany vanity, and spilled translucent face powder dusted the surface like fine, meaningless snow. The open window let in the damp, freezing air of the incoming autumn storm, fluttering the sheer white curtains against the glass. In the center of it all, propped aggressively against a crystal perfume bottle, was a heavy cream-colored envelope. The thick, custom-milled paper was sealed with dark red wax, radiating the suffocatingly sweet scent of jasmine. Isadora Croft was gone. My employer, the bride-to-be, had taken the midnight flight with her lover, leaving me behind in the wreckage of her arranged marriage. Isadora lived a life insulated by thick glass and heavy checkbooks. Her biggest crisis this week had been the caterer, using the wrong shade of white cream on the wedding cake. We existed in the same room every day, but we breathed entirely different atmospheres. She treated me less like a human being, and more like a piece of utilitarian furniture. Useful, easily replaceable, and entirely unworthy of notice. She had not left a note for me. She had not left a severance check, or a word of apology for destroying my livelihood. She only left the envelope meant for the man she was supposed to marry in less than an hour. I stood in the center of the quiet room, staring at my own pale reflection in the gilded mirror. I was wearing a simple, unadorned lilac cotton dress, entirely inappropriate for a high society wedding. It was meant only to blend into the background shadows while I adjusted her train and carried her emergency kit. Now, I was the only one left to face the fallout. Panic is a privilege. It requires the assumption that someone will come to your rescue if you scream loud enough. I did not have that luxury. If I failed to deliver this letter, if I let the billionaire groom wait at the altar like a fool in front of the city's most ruthless families, Isadora's father would demand a scapegoat. He would ensure my mother's medical treatments were cut off by morning. The physical toll of what I had to do was nothing compared to the psychological weight I carried. I remembered sitting by Evelyn's bed just 3 nights ago. The hospital ward was a sterile maze of white linoleum and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, maddening frequency. My mother's skin had looked so translucent, like fragile parchment paper, ready to tear at the slightest rough touch. She had smiled at me through the clear plastic of her oxygen mask. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythmic, mechanical assistance of a ventilator. The air in her small room always smelled of sharp, rubbing alcohol and stale apple juice. I had held her frail hand, feeling the brittle bones beneath her skin, and quietly promised her that I would handle the billing department. I had lied. The final notice was already folded in the pocket of my winter coat, a heavy anchor of terrifying numbers that dictated who got to breathe and who did not. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. That memory was the only engine driving my legs forward now. I could not let Isadora's selfish flight become Evelyn Sterling's death sentence. I picked up the heavy, scented envelope. It felt like a stone in my hand. I turned away from the mirror, walked out of the suite, and began to run. I had no car, no driver, and no umbrella. The long gravel road leading from the estate toward the cathedral was a washed-out river of gray mud and sharp, treacherous stones. The rain did not fall in delicate cinematic swirls. It was a heavy, industrial downpour that hit my shoulders like small, cold pellets of lead. Within seconds, the water soaked completely through my thin lilac cotton. The fabric clung to my skin, heavy and freezing, while my cheap shoes slipped with every desperate step. The wind howled off the Pacific Northwest coast, carrying the bitter scent of ozone, wet earth, and salt. I kept my head down, forcing my burning lungs to pull in the freezing air. The gravel bit through the thin soles of my shoes, but I did not slow down. I could not afford to think about the cold, or the humiliation that awaited me, or the sheer absurdity of running through a storm to deliver a rejection I had no part in writing. I focused entirely on the physical rhythm of my feet. Left, right. Breathe in, breathe out. hold the envelope tight against my chest so the rain would not blur the arrogant cursive ink on the front. A sharp roadside briar, wild and overgrown, lashed out from the muddy embankment. It caught the hem of my skirt just as I lunged forward. I felt the sudden violent resistance, but I refused to stop. I pulled hard. The sound of tearing fabric cut cleanly through the drumming noise of the storm. The lilac cotton gave way, leaving a jagged, muddy rip that exposed my bare knee. At the exact same moment, a long, black thorn dragged deeply across the palm of my hand, lodging itself deep in the flesh beneath my thumb. The sharp sting forced me to halt. I stood on the edge of the slick road, the rain washing the mud from my face, and looked down at my trembling hand. A normal person might have cried. A normal person might have cursed the storm, or the runaway bride, or the cruel twist of fate that placed them on this desolate road. But I did not shed a single tear. Tears were a performance, and there was no audience here in the rain. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I pinched the end of the dark thorn with my other hand and pulled it out in one clean, deliberate motion. A single drop of dark blood welled up from the puncture, instantly diluted by the relentless downpour. I watched the pink water run down my wrist, treating the physical pain as a simple, logical task to manage. Pain was just data. It meant I was still alive. It meant my legs could still carry me. I pressed the bleeding wound against my wet, ruined skirt, switched the thick envelope to my good hand, and started running again. The cathedral loomed in the distance. It was a massive structure of dark stone, heavy timber, and towering stained glass that looked more like an ancient fortress than a place of worship. The Vance family did not build sanctuaries. They built monuments to their own untouchable power. The architecture reflected their legacy perfectly. Cold, immovable, and entirely devoid of human warmth. I was nothing but a speck of dirt moving toward their immaculate, hyper-efficient world. I was not a guest. I was not a friend. I was a messenger carrying a bomb into a sanctuary of stone. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral were closed, guarding the pristine world inside from the chaotic storm outside. I leaned my full weight against the iron handles, my wet shoes slipping against the stone steps, and pushed them open. The transition was absolute. The howling wind was instantly cut off, replaced by the hushed, expectant silence of 400 wealthy guests. The air inside was stiflingly warm, thick with the overwhelming scent of 1,000 imported white lilies and the subtle, metallic tang of burning beeswax candles. It was a sterile, perfect environment, curated down to the millimeter. And then there was me. I stood in the vestibule, a dripping, muddy disruption. Water ran off the ends of my hair, splashing onto the flawless white runner that stretched down the center aisle. My lilac dress was plastered to my skin, the jagged tear at my knee exposing bruised, dirty skin. The blood from my palm had stained the side of my skirt a dull rust color. I could feel the collective gaze of the city's elite turning toward me. I saw their eyes sweep over my ruined clothes, their faces twisting in mild disgust and sharp curiosity. The quiet hum of conversation died completely, leaving a silence that had teeth. I did not lower my eyes. I did not cross my arms to hide my shivering body. I gripped the cream-colored envelope, stepped onto the white runner, and began to walk. Every step I took left a dark, wet footprint on the pristine fabric. The sound of my cheap, waterlogged shoes squelching against the floor echoed all the way up to the vaulted ceiling, a harsh, ugly sound cutting through the soft instrumental music that a string quartet was still nervously playing in the corner. I walked past rows of men in tailored Italian wool and women dripping in heavy, cold diamonds. I saw the matriarchs of old money dynasties pull their silk skirts back as I passed, their expressions tightening as if my poverty and my desperation were a contagious disease. I heard a low, mocking scoff from one of Isidora's cousins. I ignored them all, let them stare, let them judge. My focus was locked entirely on the front of the chapel, where 3 men stood waiting. Priest Thomas Thorne stood at the center, his kind, lined face shifting from professional patience to genuine confusion. Beside him stood the best man, already reaching for his phone inside his jacket, as if preparing to manage a massive corporate disaster. And then there was the groom. Julian Vance did not look like a man whose meticulously planned wedding had just been derailed in front of the city's most powerful families. He stood perfectly still, a tall, Imposing figure carved from winter stone and dark steel. He wore a heavy charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the candlelight, his posture unyielding, his broad shoulders completely relaxed. There was no panic in his dark, assessing eyes. There was no wounded pride, no trace of the volatile, destructive humiliation that usually accompanied a public abandonment among the elite. He simply watched me approach. He tracked my slow, muddy progress down the long aisle with a clinical, terrifying precision. He wasn't looking at the mud on my shoes. He was looking at the way I held my chin up despite it. I stopped 3 feet from the altar. The white lilies framing the stone steps brushed against my torn skirt, their perfect petals mocking my ragged edges. I held out my hand, offering the heavy, jasmine-scented envelope. My fingers were pale blue from the cold, trembling slightly, despite my desperate effort to keep them still. "She is not coming," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of any apology or melodramatic sorrow. It was merely a statement of fact, delivered by a messenger who had no stakes in their empire. "She took a flight an hour ago. She left this for you." The whispers broke out behind me, a rising tide of wealthy indignation and scandalized gasps. Isadora's bridesmaids, standing off to the side in identical pale green silk gowns, began to murmur and dab at their dry eyes with tissues, acting out the tragedy that none of them actually felt. The noise threatened to swallow the massive room, but Julian did not even glance at them. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand an explanation from the bewildered crowd. He stepped down from the altar, closing the distance between us. His physical presence was overwhelming, a sudden wall of quiet heat and heavy cedarwood that cut cleanly through the suffocating perfume of the lilies. He reached out and took the envelope from my grip. In doing so, his dry, warm hand brushed against my freezing, muddy fingers. The contact was brief, but it sent a sharp, involuntary shock up my arm. It was the first instance of genuine warmth I had felt since the storm began, and my tired body betrayed me by leaning slightly toward it, before I quickly locked my knees. Julian broke the wax seal with his thumb. He read the hurried, cruel words his bride had written. I watched his jaw tense for a fraction of a second, a fleeting fracture in his mental armor, before his face settled back into a mask of total indifference. He folded the thick paper carefully, slipping it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not curse Isadora. He did not throw the paper to the floor in a fit of melodramatic rage. Instead, he looked at me. He looked at the rainwater dripping from my chin, the dark mud coating my calves, the torn fabric of my cheap dress, and the small smear of blood on my hand. His gaze was heavy, taking in the ruin of my appearance. I met his eyes squarely, holding onto my dignity like a shield, because it was the only thing I had left in the world. I refused to shrink for him. The whispers behind us were escalating into a low, vicious roar. The best man, a sharp-featured executive who treated life like a hostile takeover, stepped forward and touched Julian's elbow. "Julian, we need to clear the room immediately. I'll call the press office. We can spin this. A sudden medical emergency, a family crisis. We tell them the bride collapsed. We control the narrative before the board hears a word of this embarrassment." "No," Julian said. His voice was low, possessing a resonant gravity that instantly silenced the people standing closest to us. He did not look at his best man. He didn't even shift his weight. His dark eyes remained fixed entirely on me, holding me in a quiet, intense gravity. "The narrative has already changed. The wedding will proceed." Thomas Thorne blinked, adjusting the embroidered stole around his neck. "Mr. Vance, I'm afraid I don't understand. The bride is gone." "A bride is gone," Julian corrected quietly. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice so that only I could hear the cold, transactional reality of his next words. The scent of rich mahogany and crisp peppermint washed over me, a stark contrast to the sterile lilies. "You work for her father, which means you handled the paperwork. You are aware of the penalty clauses in the merger agreement if this marriage fails to take place today. My family requires a legal union to secure the board's vote by tomorrow morning. I require a wife on paper. I do not require perfection, and I certainly do not require Isadora Croft. I need an employee who understands the assignment." I stared at him, the chill of my wet clothes suddenly forgotten beneath the weight of his calculated logic. "You want a substitute, a compliant placeholder to stand there and smile for your shareholders. I want someone who doesn't shatter when the pressure drops, he replied, his tone devoid of any romantic illusion. He glanced down at the blood drying on my hand, his expression softening by an imperceptible degree, before turning hard and practical again. You ran 3 miles in a freezing storm to deliver a letter that wasn't yours to carry. You tore your hands and ruined your clothes, and you haven't apologized once for tracking mud onto a silk carpet. You do not panic. You endure. I can work with endurance. I endure because I have no other choice, I countered, my voice tight, refusing to let him romanticize my desperation. I am not part of your world. I am just the assistant. I don't belong on an altar. Then let me employ you for a different role, Julian said smoothly. He stepped slightly to the side, positioning his broad body between me and the staring crowd, effectively shielding me from their harsh judgment without making a public show of it. Your mother is Evelyn Sterling. She is currently in the West Wing of St. Jude's, receiving experimental treatments for a failing lung. Her medical debt is crushing you. My breath caught in my throat. He knew. Of course he knew. Men like Julian Vance did not operate without exhaustive intelligence on everyone who circled their orbit. He had seen my weakness, the bleeding wound in my life that I hid from everyone else, and he was using it. Stand here with me, the billionaire offered, his dark eyes unwavering. Say the words. Sign the registry. In exchange, I will clear Evelyn's accounts by midnight. I will transfer her care to a private facility under my family's name. You will never have to worry about the cost of her breathing again. The cathedral was dead silent. 400 people were watching us, waiting for the untouchable tycoon to dismiss the ruined, muddy girl and cancel the spectacle. They expected him to protect his perfect, sterile image. They expected him to demand a flawless doll, but he had just offered me a lifeline woven from cold steel and hard cash. It was a business arrangement, a purchase of my time and my name to secure his empire. There was no grand declaration of fate, no sudden, unearned affection. This was survival. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. I looked down at the puddle of dirty rainwater forming around my cheap, ruined shoes. I thought of the beeping monitors in my mother's hospital room. I thought of the sheer, quiet terror of waking up every morning, wondering if it would be the day the bank finally cut off her air. I had spent my entire life shrinking, apologizing for taking up space, hoping to go unnoticed by the powerful people who controlled my fate. I raised my head. I looked directly into his eyes, seeing the man behind the flawless corporate mask. He was offering me a way out. It was a cold arrangement, yes, but it would keep my mother alive. Clear the debts first, I whispered, holding my ground. Make the call right now, before I step foot on the altar. A tiny, almost invisible flicker of respect passed through Julian's eyes. He didn't smile. I wasn't sure if he even knew how, but the tension in his broad shoulders loosened just a fraction. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed out a brief, authoritative message. He turned the glowing screen toward me, just long enough for me to see the confirmation of a massive wire transfer to St. Jude's accounting department. It is done, he said quietly. He put the phone away and extended his arm toward me. Shall we? I did not take his arm. I was too muddy, too wet, and far too proud to let them see me cling to him like a rescued victim. Instead, I stepped up onto the pristine marble of the altar on my own. I stood beside the billionaire, my torn lilac dress a glaring, ragged defiance against the sea of perfect white lilies. Julian turned to the bewildered clergyman. The crowd behind us erupted into a cacophony of shocked murmurs, a symphony of wealthy outrage. Julian ignored every single one of them. Begin, he told Thomas. His voice was a quiet command that left no room for debate. I stood shivering in the candlelight, bleeding and unmoored, as the ancient words of a lifelong vow were spoken over a desperate transaction. It was a cold, clinical beginning to a story that no one in this room believed would survive the winter. But as Julian shifted his stance, stepping just slightly to the left, to block the bitter draft coming from the cathedral vents from hitting my wet shoulders, I realized something the wealthy guests did not know. True protection doesn't shout, it watches, it adjusts, and it stands between you and the cold. Some places don't wait to be found, they call to you in silence. And sometimes, the most sterile deals are struck to build the warmest sanctuaries. The drive from the cathedral to the Vance ancestral estate was swallowed by the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the autumn storm against the tinted glass of the town car. I sat in the sprawling back seat, sinking into the heavy black leather, surrounded by a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The world I had known just an hour ago was entirely gone, washed away by a signed registry and a wire transfer that had officially purchased my future. Beside me, the man who was now legally, my husband stared out the window into the driving rain. He did not attempt to make small talk. He did not offer hollow reassurances or pretend that our sudden union was anything other than a calculated survival tactic for both of us. The distance between us on the leather seat was only a matter of inches, but it felt like a vast, uncrossable chasm of wealth, power, and unspoken trauma. The estate loomed out of the coastal fog, a staggering monument of dark gray stone, sharp crescent gables, and towering windows that reflected the turbulent gray water of the Pacific Ocean. There was no warmth in its architecture. It was designed to withstand centuries of battering winds and to keep the chaotic, unpredictable world firmly locked outside. As the heavy iron gates parted and the car glided up the sweeping gravel driveway, I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest. Evelyn was breathing easier in her hospital bed right now, untethered from the terrifying hum of financial ruin. I had secured her life, but as I looked up at the towering stone walls of my new home, I realized the precise weight of the reality I had just walked into. The heavy mahogany front doors swung open the moment the car rolled to a halt. I stepped out into the biting wind, immediately hit by a wall of warm air from the foyer that carried the deep, grounding scent of ancient timber, sharp mint, and the bitter tang of sea salt. The interior of the manor was a masterpiece of sterile, old-money luxury. Cold marble floors stretched endlessly down dim corridors, lined with heavy oil portraits and silent, observing statues. The domestic staff moved like ghosts, their expressions perfectly neutral, betraying no surprise at the sight of their billionaire employer, returning with a shivering, mud-soaked assistant instead of a pristine socialite bride. Julian dismissed the staff with a single, subtle flick of his wrist. He did not introduce me. He did not offer a grand tour of his sprawling empire. He simply turned his dark, assessing gaze toward me, his broad shoulders blocking the draft from the open doors. His eyes tracked the violent shivering of my shoulders, the dark mud caked around my calves, and the jagged, ruined hem of my lilac cotton dress. He reached out, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second, before he pointed toward the grand sweeping staircase. He instructed me to take the primary guest suite in the east wing, stating that it had already been prepared. His tone was a deep, echoing baritone that perfectly matched the atmospheric pressure of the stone house. He turned and walked down the opposite hall toward his study, leaving me entirely alone in the vast, echoing foyer. The guest suite was the size of my mother's entire apartment. It was a beautiful, suffocating room, draped in heavy velvet curtains, and dominated by a massive four-poster bed, covered in pristine white linens. A fire was already crackling in the marble hearth, casting long, flickering shadow siglums across the polished hardwood floor. But it was the walk-in closet that made the breath catch sharply in my throat. I pushed the mirrored doors open, expecting empty shelves. Instead, I found a meticulously curated boutique of premeditated perfection. Rows upon rows of designer silk dresses, tailored cashmere sweaters, and sharply cut wool trousers hung in exact, color-coordinated precision. The tags were still attached, displaying numbers that I could have paid for months of Evelyn's experimental treatments. They were flawless, jewel-toned garments designed to drape elegantly over the frame of a wealthy tycoon's trophy. They were meant for Isadora Croft or someone exactly like her. They were the uniform of a woman whose only job was to look beautiful, remain silent, and reflect her husband's untouchable status to the outside world. I reached out, running my fingertips over the sleeve of an emerald green silk gown. The fabric was unimaginably soft, a whisper of pure luxury against my raw, cold skin. For a fleeting second, the sheer exhaustion of my life tempted me. It would be so incredibly easy to surrender. To strip away the muddy, torn remnants of my working-class reality, slip into the emerald silk, and allow myself to become the docile, perfectly packaged placeholder he had purchased. It would be comfortable, it would be safe. I pulled my hand back as if the silk had burned me. I stepped back from the closet, my breathing shallow and fast. I was poor, I was desperately tired, and I had sold my name to a stranger. But I had not sold my dignity. If I put on those clothes, I would be erasing the last remaining piece of Clara Sterling. I would become nothing more than a ghost haunting Isadora's abandoned wardrobe. I turned my back on the closet and walked into the sprawling ensuite bathroom. The floor was heated beneath my freezing feet. I peeled the ruined lilac dress from my shivering body, wincing as the fabric pulled against the deep scratch on my palm. I stood under the scalding spray of the rainfall shower until the water washing over my feet finally ran clear of mud and dried blood. When I stepped out, wrapped tightly in a thick towel, I did not go to the closet to find a fresh robe. Instead, I picked up my torn, wet dress from the marble floor. I wrung the excess water out of the cheap cotton by hand, stretching the fabric as best as I could. I walked back into the bedroom, pulled a heavy wooden chair close to the hearth, and draped the dress over the back to dry. I sat there for over an hour, watching the firelight dance across the jagged tear at the hem. When the fabric was finally dry, stiffened slightly by the remnants of the storm, I put it back on. The cold cotton clung uncomfortably to my skin, and the draft from the high windows bit at my exposed knee through the rib. It was a stubborn, ridiculous choice, but as I smoothed my hands down the faded fabric, I felt the familiar, protective weight of my own autonomy settle back over my shoulders. It was a ragged shield, but it was mine. I walked out of the suite, intending to find the kitchen, to ask for a simple glass of water. The sprawling corridor was dark, illuminated only by the weak, gray light filtering through the tall windows. As I turned the corner, I stopped dead. Julian was standing at the far end of the hall, speaking in low, clipped tones to a security detail. He wore a fresh charcoal sweater that softened the sharp, intimidating lines of his broad chest, but his posture remained as rigid as the stone walls around us. He turned his head, sensing my presence long before I made a sound. His dark eyes locked onto me, sweeping slowly from my damp, unstyled hair down to the jagged, torn hem of the cheap cotton dress. The security guard stopped speaking midway through a sentence, turning to follow his employer's gaze. The silence in the hallway stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. I stood my ground, my chin tilted up, refusing to cross my arms or hide the ruined state of my clothes. I waited for the cold billionaire to express his disgust. I waited for him to issue a sharp command, to order me back to the closet to put on the expensive silk uniform he had provided. Julian did not say a word. He stared at the torn fabric, then lifted his gaze to meet my eyes. I saw an imperceptible change in his expression. A slight narrowing of his eyes, a tiny loosening of the tension in his square jaw. It was a profound, quiet recognition. He understood exactly what I was doing. He raised a hand, silently dismissing the security guard, and then turned and walked back toward the west wing, leaving me alone in the dim corridor. I returned to my room, my pulse racing wildly in my chest. I had drawn the first boundary of our transactional marriage, and the untouchable tycoon had allowed it to stand. I sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring blankly at the rain lashing against the glass. 20 minutes later, the absolute silence of the suite was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible sound out in the hallway. It was a deliberate, quiet click, followed by the faint thud of footsteps retreating down the carpeted floor. I stood up, walked to the heavy oak door, and pulled it open. The corridor was empty, but resting on the floor, perfectly centered on the threshold, was a vintage wooden sewing box. I knelt slowly, my fingers tracing the smooth, polished grain of the heavy wood. It was an antique, worn at the corners from decades of careful use, secured by a small brass clasp. I flipped the latch and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a row of gleaming silver needles, a small pair of iron scissors, and a single spool of fine, vibrant green silk thread. There was no note. There was no demand to fix my appearance. He had simply looked at my ragged edges, understood my absolute refusal to wear another woman's armor, and provided me with the precise tools I needed to repair my own. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. It waits in the quiet offering of a silver needle on a rainy afternoon, speaking a language of practical care that requires no translation. I picked up the heavy wooden box, holding it against my chest. The sprawling guest suite suddenly felt too vast, too silent for the task at hand. I wanted the grounding comfort of a smaller space, somewhere that didn't feel like a museum of isolated perfection. I stepped back out into the hall and quietly made my way downstairs, navigating the maze of dim corridors until I found the open doors of the main study. The room was a cavernous sanctuary of forgotten knowledge. Towering shelves of unread, leather-bound books lined the dark paneled walls, and the scent of ancient paper, cold ash, and dry cedar hung thick in the air. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, where a low fire was already burning, casting a warm amber glow over a pair of worn leather wingback chairs. The room felt lived in, bearing the quiet, heavy soul of the man who occupied it. I chose the chair closest to the hearth, sinking into the cracked leather, and placed the wooden sewing box on my lap. I took the dress off, draping it carefully over my knees while I sat in my simple white slip. I threaded the silver needle with the vibrant green silk. The process of mending is a slow, methodical ritual that forces the mind to narrow its focus to the exact point where metal pierces fabric. I aligned the jagged edges of the torn lilac cotton, smoothing out the frayed threads with my thumb. The needle bit into the cloth. I pulled the thread taut, feeling the slight resistance before the silk slid through, pulling the broken pieces back together. I did not attempt to hide the repair. The green silk stood out starkly against the faded lilac, creating a bright, deliberate scar across the fabric. It was a testament to survival, a physical record of the violent storm, and the desperate run that had brought me to this quiet room. I had finished half the seam when the atmospheric pressure in the study suddenly shifted. I did not need to look up to know he had entered the room. The scent of subtle mint cut through the smell of old books, and the heavy, rhythmic sound of his footsteps paused just inside the doorway. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the fabric in my lap, sliding the needle through the cotton. The thread pulled with a soft, distinct hiss. Julian walked slowly across the Persian rug. He did not speak. I heard the clink of heavy crystal as he moved to the small bar cart in the corner. Liquid poured into a glass, but he did not drink it. He walked over to the hearth and lowered his massive frame into the opposite wingback chair. The leather groaned softly under his weight. He rested his forearms on his knees, holding the untouched glass of amber liquid, and simply watched me work. The silence stretched between us, thick and absolute. It was not the cold, terrifying silence of the cathedral, nor the dismissive silence of Isidora's world. It was a heavy, observational quiet, filled only by the crackle of the popping sap in the fireplace and the rhythmic pull of my green silk thread. "You didn't touch the closet," Julian finally said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the space between us. I pushed the silver needle through the cotton, catching the edge of the tear. I did not look up. "They are not my clothes, Mr. Vance. They belong to my wife," he countered smoothly, testing the boundary of our new reality. "They belong to a ghost," I corrected, pulling the thread tight. The tension of the silk perfectly mirrored the rigid air in the room. "I am not a mannequin designed to fill Isadora Croft's abandoned wardrobe. You bought my presence at the altar to secure your merger. You bought my signature on a legal document to clear my mother's medical debt, but you did not buy my submission." I tied off a small knot, clipped the excess silk with the heavy iron scissors, and finally lifted my chin to meet his gaze. His dark eyes were fixed to my face, completely unreadable, absorbing the blunt force of my defiance without a single flinch. "You do not own me," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, unwavering register. "You do not possess the right to dress me like a doll, to erase where I came from, or to mold me into a perfect reflection of your wealth. I will stand beside you when your board requires it. I will keep your secrets. But inside this house, I remain myself. This is the boundary. I will not disappear for you." Julian watched me. The firelight caught the sharp, unforgiving angles of his jaw, highlighting the deep exhaustion hiding just beneath his stoic mask. He set the crystal glass down on the small table between us. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance, the untouchable billionaire suddenly grounding himself entirely in my space. "Say you're not her," he murmured. I paused. The silver needle hovered frozen above the lilac fabric. I studied the hard lines of his face, suddenly seeing the profound, quiet damage hidden behind his corporate armor. He was a man who had been surrounded his entire life by people who viewed him solely as a transaction, an endless bank account to be manipulated, flattered, and ultimately abandoned. "Swear to me you aren't just playing a part," Julian pleaded, his voice dropping to a raw near whisper that carried infinitely more weight than a shout. "Tell me you won't smile to my face and run the moment the silence in this house gets too loud." I held his gaze, refusing to let the vulnerability in the room break my steady composure. "I have nowhere to run to, and I do not run from silence." Julian slowly exhaled, a long, controlled breath that seemed to release a fraction of the heavy armor he wore. He did not offer me a grand, empty promise. He did not reach across the space to offer unearned physical comfort. He simply nodded, a slow, profound gesture of mutual understanding, and leaned back into the shadows of the wingback chair. I lowered my eyes and pushed the silver sealed back into the fabric. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the silk thread pulling through the cotton resumed. Julian remained in the chair opposite me, listening to the rain beat against the heavy window panes, perfectly content to share the quiet sanctuary of the dim room. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where it is found without being spoken. 2 months passed in a quiet, fragile truce. The relentless autumn storms that battered the coastal cliffs finally broke one dawn, leaving the estate wrapped in a thick, silver mist. I woke up in the massive 4-poster bed, the pristine white linen still feeling entirely foreign against my skin. The sheer silence of the room was deafening. Before this marriage, my mornings had been dictated by the shrill, frantic alarms of unpaid billing departments, the sterile hum of Evelyn's hospital ward, and the sharp, demanding voice of Isadora Croft requiring her morning schedule. Now, there was nothing but the distant, rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean against the jagged rocks below. The absence of panic felt less like peace, and more like a vacuum, waiting to pull me under. I pushed the heavy velvet covers aside and stood up. I did not open the walk-in closet to look at the rows of emerald silk and tailored cashmere that had been purchased for a ghost. Instead, I reached for the heavy wooden chair by the hearth and put on my own pale lilac dress. I needed to move. I needed a physical task to anchor my mind before the sheer scale of the estate drove me mad. I navigated the labyrinth of the east wing, my cheap shoes making no sound against the sprawling expanse of imported marble. The corridors were lined with the heavy, unsmiling oil portraits of the Vance ancestry. Their painted eyes seemed to track the ragged hem of my dress with silent, aristocratic judgment, a reminder that I was merely a transactional anomaly, in a bloodline built on ruthless corporate mergers. I kept my head down, following the subtle draft of salt and damp earth until I found a heavy iron-wrought side door at the end of a forgotten hallway. The hinges groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Stepping out into the biting chill of the morning, I found myself in a sprawling, walled courtyard that had been entirely surrendered to nature. It was the old kitchen garden. The Vance family did not deal in dirt. Their meals arrived perfectly plated by private chefs, their floral arrangements curated by imported designers who specialized in sterile perfection. This small, hidden patch of earth had been allowed to run wild, free from the manicured, hyper-efficient control that governed the rest of the billionaire's empire. Thick, fragrant bushes of wild lavender spilled over the cracked stone pathways, their purple heads heavy with morning dew. Tangled patches of chamomile and wild mint grew fiercely between the rusted iron trellises. It was chaotic, overgrown, and breathtakingly alive. I knelt immediately onto the wet, moss-covered stone path. The physical action of working with the earth was a grounding mechanism, a way to pull myself out of the suffocating luxury of the manor and back into the reality of my own hands. I wanted to gather the lavender and chamomile. I wanted to dry the herbs, bundle them with twine, and send them to this west wing of St. Jude's. The sharp, sterile smell of the hospital ward always made my mother anxious, increasing her heart rate and fighting the mechanical rhythm of her ventilator. A small bundle of these herbs would be a piece of the outside world, a quiet, tactile proof that I was still fighting for her, even from inside these stone walls. I found a discarded, weathered wicker basket leaning against a rotting wooden shed and pulled it into the damp grass. I did not have garden shears, so I worked with my bare hands. I snapped the thick, woody stems of the lavender, the the sharp, calming scent instantly bursting into the cold morning air. The damp, dark loam caked beneath my fingernails and smeared across the palms of my hands. The moisture from the tall grass quickly soaked through the knees of my damp skirt, chilling my skin. But I did not stop. I welcomed the dirt. The soil was honest. Unlike the towering marble columns and the empty designer clothes upstairs, the earth did not demand a performance. It simply required labor, and labor was the only language I had ever been allowed to speak fluently. The atmospheric pressure in the courtyard shifted entirely before I heard a single footstep. The heavy aroma of wet pine and crisp mint cut cleanly through the smell of the damp soil and crushed herbs. I froze, my muddy hands hovering over the wicker basket. I slowly turned my head. Julian Vance stood at the edge of the courtyard, framed by the rusted iron door. He wore a pristine, impeccably tailored charcoal wool suit, the dark fabric absorbing the muted silver light of the foggy morning. His silk tie was perfectly knotted, his posture rigid and commanding. He looked exactly like the ruthless tycoon who shattered rival companies before breakfast, a man who viewed the entire world as a chessboard of assets and liabilities. The contrast between his flawless, untouchable wealth and my muddy, kneeling reality was painfully sharp. I braced myself for the inevitable reprimand. I was the wife on paper. I was supposed to be a polished, invisible asset, not a disheveled laborer digging in the mud behind the manor. A tall, older man in a starched gray uniform, the head of the household staff, hurried down the stone path just a few paces behind his employer. The attendant stopped short, his eyes widening in sheer, unmasked horror as he took in the sight of my ruined dress and soil-stained hands. "Sir, I apologize profoundly," the attendant stammered, his voice tight with professional panic. He quickly stepped past Julian, reaching out toward me. "I will have the groundskeeper clear this overgrown area immediately. Madam, please, you must not soil yourself. Allow me to take that dirty basket. Step back." The command was not shouted. It was delivered in a low, gravelly register that barely carried over the sound of the distant crashing waves. Yet it possessed an absolute, undeniable authority that instantly froze the attendant in his tracks. Julian raised a single hand, a microscopic gesture of dismissal. "Leave us," my husband instructed quietly, his dark eyes never leaving my face. The attendant bowed sharply, his face pale, and retreated with hurried, silent steps back into the safety of the stone manor. The heavy iron door clicked shut, leaving us entirely alone in the damp, fragrant isolation of the overgrown garden. I stayed kneeling in the wet grass, my heartbeat drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm. I clutched the half-filled wicker basket against my stomach, defensively shielding the crushed lavender. I waited for him to speak, to outline the boundaries of my acceptable behavior, to remind me of the immense financial debt that had purchased my compliance. He did not lecture me. He did not ask what I was doing. Julian simply stepped off the immaculate, dry stone pathway. I watched, completely paralyzed by confusion, as his expensive, polished leather Oxfords sank immediately into the dark, rain-soaked mud. He walked deliberately through the tall, wet grass, closing the distance between us. When he reached my side, the untouchable billionaire did not stand over me to dictate his terms. He lowered his massive frame and knelt directly into the wet earth. The damp soil instantly seeped into the knees of his tailored charcoal trousers, ruining thousands of dollars worth of bespoke wool in a matter of seconds. I gasped softly, my eyes darting from the dark mud, staining his suit, back up to his unreadable face. "You are ruining your clothes," I whispered, the words tumbling out of my mouth before my guarded mind could stop them. My voice sounded incredibly small, fragile against the heavy, stoic weight of his presence. "They are just clothes," Julian replied, his tone entirely devoid of the arrogance or irritation I had braced myself for. He reached out with his large, scarred hands and gently took the heavy, dirt-stained wicker basket from my trembling grip. He set it on his own ruined knee, holding it steady to free my hands. He looked down at the fragrant pile of purple and white flowers. "Who is the harvest for?" "Evelyn," I answered, the name slipping through the cracks in my armor. I looked down at my muddy fingers, unable to maintain eye contact with the profound intensity of his gaze. The smell of the antiseptic in the wards. "It terrifies her. I wanted to dry these, to send her a piece of the outside." a proof that the world is still breathing while she is trapped in that room. Julian nodded slowly. He did not offer a hollow, manufactured sympathy. He did not pull out his phone to order a team of landscapers to build her a private botanical garden, throwing his massive wealth at the problem to make it disappear. He simply shifted his weight in the mud, holding the woven basket slightly closer to me, making it easier for me to drop the freshly cut stems inside. We worked in absolute, unbroken silence for the next 20 minutes. The rhythmic process of the harvest became a shared physical meditation. I snapped the thick stems of the chamomile. He caught them and arranged them neatly in the wicker weave. His broad shoulders blocked the biting, salty coastal wind, creating a quiet pocket of warm, still air between us. He was a man who had spent his entire life insulated by power, yet he knelt willingly in the dirt, choosing to share the burden of my quiet labor. When the basket was entirely full, I sat back on my heels, my hands coated in dark loam and crushed green leaves. Julian stood up effortlessly, the ruined, muddy fabric of his trousers clinging to his long legs. I reached out to take the heavy basket from him, assuming the lesson in humility was over. He smoothly shifted it out of my reach, holding it firmly by the woven handle. He did not hand the dirty burden back to me. He carried it himself. We walked back into the estate together, a strange, silent procession. The contrast was almost comical. The pristine, sterile marble corridors of the ancestral home, and the two of us tracking dark, wet footprints and fallen lavender petals across the flawless floors like unrepentant intruders. We bypassed the formal dining rooms and entered the sprawling, industrial-style kitchen in the west wing. It was a cavern of cold, stainless steel counters, copper pots hanging in perfect, aggressive symmetry, and massive double-door refrigerators. The room was entirely empty. The household staff had likely scattered the moment the internal security cameras caught their employer heading in this direction covered in mud. Julian set the wicker basket down on the edge of the massive steel island. I moved immediately to the deep porcelain sink, turning on the heavy brass faucet to wash the thick soil from my hands. The warm water cascaded over my skin, swirling the dark earth down the drain, leaving only the dull ache of the cold air on my knuckles. I dried my hands on a linen towel and returned to the basket. I separated a handful of the fresh chamomile blossoms from the main harvest. The rest would be carefully tied with twine and hung to dry for my mother. But right now, my chest felt tight with an unspoken tension, and I desperately needed the grounding comfort of a warm, familiar ritual. I found a heavy cast-iron kettle on the back of the massive gas stove, filled it with filtered water, and ignited the blue flame beneath it. Julian pulled a simple wooden stool from beneath the counter and sat down on the opposite side of the steel island. He watched my movements with that same intense, clinical focus he used in the boardroom, but the sharp edges of his gaze were noticeably softer now. The heavy, impenetrable armor of the CEO had been temporarily stripped away in the garden, leaving behind a quiet, intensely observant man in ruined clothes. "This house," Julian began, his voice breaking the kitchen's silence with a low, gravelly resonance that vibrated against the metal surfaces. It was built to withstand coastal storms, corporate enemies, and the fluctuating tides of the global market. My grandfather believed that if you built the walls thick enough, and the doors heavy enough, nothing could ever hurt the people inside. I opened a high cabinet and retrieved two simple, mismatched ceramic mugs, deliberately bypassing the display of delicate, translucent bone china that sat untouched behind the glass doors. "Did it work?" I asked softly, dropping the fresh, bruised chamomile blossoms into a metal steeper. Julian's square jaw tightened. He looked away, his dark eyes fixing on the rain-streaked window above the porcelain sink. "No. It just ensured that the people trapped inside eventually froze to death." The iron kettle began to whistle, a sharp, piercing note that sliced through the heavy, melancholic atmosphere. I turned off the burner, pouring the boiling water over the crushed herbs. The immediate soothing scent of warm earth, honey, and dried apple filled the sterile kitchen, aggressively pushing back against the sharp, clinical smell of the stainless steel counters. "I was raised in these rooms," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a raw, near whisper. "I was meticulously taught that every human interaction was a transaction. Every relationship was a calculated merger. You do not love, You acquire, you do not trust. You verify and bind with legal clauses. When my father arranged the engagement with Isadora, it was simply another corporate acquisition, a strategic consolidation of two legacies designed to stabilize a volatile stock price. I placed the steaming ceramic mug on the counter and pushed it slowly across the cold steel surface until it rested just inches from his hand. I wrapped my own cold, trembling fingers around my mug, letting the intense heat seep directly into my skin. She was perfect on paper, I murmured, staring down into the golden liquid, tracing the rim of the cup. She knew the rules of your world instinctively. She knew how to wear the emerald silk without letting the fabric suffocate her. She knew how to be a ghost, Julian corrected quietly, rejecting my defense of the woman who had abandoned him. His large, calloused hands wrapped around the simple ceramic mug, completely dwarfing it. He didn't lift the tea to drink. He just let the physical warmth anchor him to the present moment. Isadora was exactly what this family demanded, a flawless, polished reflection of wealth. She wanted separate wings, charity galas, and scheduled appearances. It was a well-crafted arrangement, but it was entirely lifeless. He lifted his head, his dark eyes pinning me in place. The absolute intensity in his stare made my breath catch sharply in the back of my throat. "Then you walked down the aisle," he said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute truth. You were shivering. You were bleeding. Your cotton dress was torn, and you were tracking dark mud onto $1 million silk runner. You were completely surrounded by people who wanted to destroy you for simply daring to exist in their curated space. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening desperately on my mug until my knuckles turned white. I ruined the aesthetic of your perfect transaction. You were the first real thing to walk through those doors in 30 years. Julian countered, his tone fierce but strictly controlled. You didn't shrink under their judgment. You didn't apologize for surviving the storm. I watched you refuse to yield to the suffocating pressure of that room. And for the first time in my entire life, I wanted to tear up the contract. I didn't choose you to save a corporate merger, Clara. I chose you because I wanted to remember what it felt like to stand next to someone who was actually alive. The massive kitchen fell dead silent. The only sound in the world was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the far wall and the gentle hum of the industrial refrigerators. My chest heaved with the sheer force of my pounding pulse. I looked down, breaking the intense eye contact, suddenly hyper-aware of how disheveled and exhausted I must look. I reached up nervously with a trembling hand to push a damp, tangled strand of hair behind my ear, my fingers accidentally brushing against my own cheek. Julian moved before my mind could even register the shift in the air. He stood up from the wooden stool, stepping deliberately around the massive steel island, closing the physical distance between us in 2 long, fluid strides. The warm, overwhelming musk of sandalwood and rain enveloped me completely. I froze, my spine pressing lightly against the cold edge of the metal counter. My instinct was to brace for impact, expecting him to step back, to suddenly remember who he was and re-establish the clinical, safe distance that usually governed his empire. He didn't. He stopped just inches away, his massive frame towering over me, casting a broad, protective shadow that completely blocked out the harsh fluorescent lighting of the kitchen ceiling. He slowly raised his right hand. "Tell me to stop," Julian whispered. The quiet command hung in the heavy air between us. He was offering me the explicit choice to push him away, to maintain the defensive walls I had spent a lifetime building. I couldn't speak. My voice had entirely abandoned me. I looked up at him, reading the raw, unguarded hesitation swirling in the depths of his dark eyes. I gave a microscopic, barely perceptible shake of my head. I didn't want him to stop. His rough, warm thumb gently touched my cheekbone. The physical contact sent a sharp, electric jolt straight through my chest, chasing away the lingering chill of the morning garden. He moved his thumb in a slow, deliberate sweep across my skin, carefully wiping away a dark smear of wet garden soil that had inadvertently transferred from my hands to my face during the harvest. His hand lingered on my skin. He didn't pull away once the dirt was gone. He just let his broad, calloused palm rest against the curve of my jaw, his fingers feeling the frantic, rapid pulse beating wildly in my throat. His touch was so incredibly gentle, so profoundly careful, providing a stark, breathtaking contrast to the cold stone of the estate and the ruthless, unforgiving reputation of his name. I leaned into his palm. It was a tiny, almost invisible movement, a millimeter of surrendered space, but Julian felt it. A ragged, heavy exhale escaped his parted lips. A sound that suggested he had been holding his breath since the exact moment we met at the altar. He didn't pull me into a desperate, rushing embrace. He didn't ruin the fragile safety of the moment by demanding more physical intimacy than I was ready to give. He simply stood there in the quiet kitchen, a billionaire tycoon in ruined, mud-stained trousers, holding my face in the silence as if I were the most precious, irreplaceable thing in his entire empire. The vast, uncrossable distance between us had finally evaporated. It was not bridged by grand declarations, nor by signed legal documents and cleared bank accounts. It was dismantled through the shared silence of a damp garden, the simple warmth of a ceramic cup of chamomile, and the gentle, respectful removal of a smudge of earth. The heavy ice around my guarded heart did not shatter violently. It simply melted, quietly and completely. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person, the fragile, unspoken peace we had forged in the cold. Stainless steel kitchen stretched quietly into our second month together, before the outside world violently breached our newly built walls. It happened on a fog-choked Tuesday afternoon. The coastal fog had rolled in thick, heavy, and unforgiving, swallowing the jagged cliffs below the Vance estate and pressing against the tall glass windows like a physical weight. I was sitting alone in the main study, seeking refuge in the dim amber light of the hearth. My hand rested near the vintage wooden sewing box my husband had given me, my fingers mindlessly tracing the brass clasp as I read a heavy, leather-bound book. The absolute silence of the room was suddenly, brutally shattered by the ringing of the antique telephone on the mahogany desk. The household staff had strict, unwavering orders to intercept all external lines. No unwanted noise was ever allowed to penetrate this sanctuary, but this particular phone was a direct, private extension, bypassing the gatekeepers. The shrill, mechanical ringing felt like an alarm bell echoing through a museum, jarring and wrong. I placed my book down on the cracked leather of the wingback chair. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the cold brass receiver. The knot of dread in my stomach tightened, a primal instinct warning me that the safety of the last few weeks was an illusion. When I finally lifted it to my ear, I did not hear the measured, professional voice of a corporate assistant or a hospital administrator. "This is how you pay me back, Clara?" The voice was a sharp, venomous hiss that instantly made the blood run cold in my veins. It was Isadora Croft. The runaway bride had apparently found a spare moment between her reckless European escape and her new lover's schedule to check the financial fallout of her abandoned wedding. Her tone was dripping with the toxic, entitled arrogance that I had spent the last 2 years enduring in silent, necessary submission. "You couldn't just stand there and take the humiliation like you were paid to do," Isadora sneered, her voice clipping harshly through the static of the international line. "You had to play the tragic, noble martyr. You manipulated a billionaire into marrying you on the spot. Did you really think my father would just let that stand? Did you think our family would allow the help to steal my position and face zero consequences?" "You left," I replied. My voice was remarkably steady, though my free hand gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so tightly. My knuckles turned a bruised white. "You left your position on a vanity table, weighed down by a crystal perfume bottle. I only delivered the message you were too much of a coward to hand him yourself. And you profited from it," she snapped, the venom escalating into a triumphant, cruel pitch. "But you forgot who actually holds the leverage in your pathetic little life." "I made a phone call this morning, Clara. The board of directors at St. Jude's Hospital still answers to Croft money. Julian may have cleared Evelyn's past debt, but her ongoing experimental respiratory treatments require constant authorization from the hospital's private trustees. Trustees my father controls. By tomorrow morning, your fragile mother is going to be moved out of the private West Wing and placed back into the state-funded lottery pool. She won't survive the week. I am going to remind you exactly where you belong." The air vanished entirely from my lungs. A terrifying icy numbness spread outward from the center of my chest, freezing the blood in my veins. This was the absolute crushing reality of Huasadr. It did not matter how hard you fought, how much personal pride you maintained, or how many contracts you signed in desperation. The wealthy always held the power to simply turn off the oxygen. I closed my eyes, the familiar, suffocating weight of panic threatening to break through my carefully constructed mental armor. I could already smell the sharp rubbing alcohol and stale apple juice of the public ward. I could hear the erratic, failing rhythm of the ventilator. Before I could draw a shallow breath to respond, a large, calloused hand smoothly reached over my shoulder and took the heavy brass receiver directly from my trembling grip. I gasped, spinning around. Julian had entered the study without making a single sound. He stood incredibly close to me, his broad chest radiating a solid, grounding heat that instantly countered the freezing terror taking root in my bones. His dark eyes were fixed on my pale face, reading the sheer, unadulterated panic in my expression with clinical precision. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not demand a summary of the threat. He simply lifted the phone to his own ear. He listened for exactly 3 seconds to Isadora's continuing, spiteful tirade. His square jaw tightened, a barely noticeable hardening in the granite lines of his face that signaled an absolute, ruinous anger. It was not the loud, explosive rage of a weak, emotional man. It was the terrifying, cold wrath of a titan who was about to casually dismantle an empire. Isadora, Julian interrupted. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that instantly silenced the woman on the other end of the line. You seem to be operating under severely outdated intelligence. The private trustees at St. Jude's no longer answer to your father's checkbook. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Vance Enterprises completed a hostile, aggressive acquisition of the hospital's primary medical group. Evelyn Sterling's care is now a classified internal asset of my family. If you, or anyone sharing your surname, ever attempt to interfere with her medical charts again, I will personally ensure your father's holding company is completely liquidated before the end of the fiscal quarter. Do not ever call this number again. There was a dead, suffocating silence on the line. The tycoon did not wait for a response, nor did he offer a closing pleasantry. He placed the heavy brass receiver back onto its cradle with a soft, final, and utterly devastating click. He turned his full attention back to me. The ruthless corporate executioner vanished, instantly replaced by the quiet, intensely observant protector. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing against the curve of my shoulder to ground me in the present moment. It's over, Clara. The threat is neutralized. She cannot touch Evelyn. You are safe. I stood in the center of the dim study, my blood rushing so loudly in my ears it drowned out the storm. I should have felt profound, overwhelming relief. I should have collapsed into his broad chest, weeping with gratitude that the towering, terrifying burden of my mother's illness was finally, permanently lifted from my shoulders. Instead, a deep, unsettling realization began to crystallize in my mind, sharp and cold. I looked at the massive, ancient stone fireplace, at the towering shelves of unread leather-bound books, and finally at the powerful, untouchable billionaire standing before me. He had saved my mother with a single phone call, using a level of wealth and ruthless influence I could barely comprehend. He had placed me inside a beautiful, impenetrable sanctuary where no external force could ever hurt me again. But absolute protection, built entirely on someone else's power, can quickly become its own kind of cage. I had spent my entire adult life relying on the toxic mercy of people who held absolute power over me. First, the relentless debt collectors, then the entitled Croft family, and now, my stoic husband. Julian was not cruel. In fact, his quiet kindness and silent acts of service were the most beautiful things I had ever experienced. But his power was so absolute, so overwhelmingly vast, that it threatened to swallow my identity completely. If I stayed in this sprawling coastal manor, surrounded by silent staff, heavy security, and endless, unearned wealth, I would never know if I was truly standing on my own 2 feet. I would always wonder if I was simply being propped up by his massive shadow. To be a true partner to a man like him, I needed to know that I existed as a complete, resilient person, independent of a transactional rescue. I waited until he departed for a mandatory, emergency shareholder meeting in the city later that afternoon. The moment his long black town car disappeared down the winding gravel driveway, swallowed by the coastal fog, I walked upstairs to the sprawling guest suite in the east wing. I did not open the mirrored doors of the walk-in closet. The rows of emerald silk, tailored cashmere, and flawless designer garments remained untouched, hanging in their premeditated, sterile perfection. They belonged to a world of commodified wives, a world I was refusing to inherit. I walked to the small wooden dresser and pulled out the only items that actually belonged to me. I packed a small, faded canvas duffel bag. Inside, I placed a worn pair of jeans, a few simple, practical cotton sweaters, and a small stack of Evelyn's old handwritten letters, bound tightly together with rough twine. I was already wearing my torn lilac, cotton dress. It was the only armor I required. I left the vintage wooden sewing box on the edge of the massive, unmade four-poster bed, a silent, respectful acknowledgement of the genuine care he had shown me. I sat down at the heavy mahogany vanity and pulled out a single sheet of plain white paper and a fountain pen. I did not write a dramatic, sweeping letter of romantic heartbreak, nor did I express any lingering anger. My departure was not a punishment or a test of his devotion. It was a desperate, necessary reclamation of my own soul. "Julian," I wrote, my handwriting small and precise against the stark white page. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever offered. You kept my mother breathing. I will spend the rest of my life honoring that profound debt. But I cannot build a permanent life inside a space that I did not choose. I have spent my entire existence surviving under the crushing weight of other people's power and expectations. Before I can ever be a true partner, I need to know how to simply exist on my own terms. I need to breathe air that I authorized myself. Please do not send your security team to retrieve me. I am not running away, and I am not lost. I am just finding my own ground." I left the note propped against the crystal lamp, picked up my canvas bag, and walked out of the Vance ancestral estate. I did not ask the household staff to arrange a private car. I walked the 3 miles down the coastal road to the local transit station on foot, listening to the crunch of the gravel beneath my cheap shoes, letting the biting, salty wind whip through my hair. I felt the cold, sharp sting of reality on my cheeks. Every step I took away from the staggering wealth of the estate felt like a heavy, invisible stone being lifted from my chest. The massive iron gates closed behind me with a final, heavy clang, separating me from the world of sterile perfection. I boarded a cheap, rattling public bus that traveled 3 hours further north, up the rugged, unforgiving Pacific coastline. My destination was a tiny, forgotten fishing village, where my late grandmother had left behind a small, weathered stone cottage. It had sat empty for years, a quiet relic of a working-class family that had slowly been erased by medical debts and bad luck. It was entirely devoid of luxury, completely stripped of modern efficiency, and it was absolutely perfect. The cottage sat on a narrow, rocky bluff, overlooking the turbulent gray ocean, surrounded by tall, ancient pine trees that swayed and groaned in the relentless coastal wind. The wooden porch sagged slightly under my weight, the damp floorboards complaining with a loud, rhythmic creak as I unlocked the heavy rusted front door. The interior smelled of old dust, dried pine needles, and deep, settled ocean dampness. The space was incredibly small, consisting of a single main room with a cast-iron wood stove, a tiny kitchenette with chipped laminate counters, and a narrow, sagging bed pushed into the far corner. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling at the edges, a testament to decades of salt air and neglect. There was no imported marble here. There were no oil portraits staring down in aristocratic judgment. The silence here was not the terrifying, heavy vacuum of the Billionaire's manor. It was the soft, breathing quiet of a space that belonged entirely to me. I spent the following weeks working until my muscles ached and my hands were raw, ushering in our 3rd month of marriage. I scrubbed the ancient wooden floors with harsh soap and freezing cold water. I cleared the thick cobwebs from the exposed ceiling beams, a deeply physical metaphor for washing away the transactional grime of my past life. I chopped kindling from fallen branches in the woods behind the house, feeding the small iron stove until the deep, damp chill was finally driven from the stone walls. I survived on cheap black tea, canned soup, and the profound, intoxicating peace of absolute independence. For the first time in my entire life, nobody was watching me. Nobody was evaluating my worth, tracking my debts, or expecting me to perform a flawless role. I was alone and I was safe. Yet, as the evening stretched into long dark nights, lit only by the flickering orange glow of the wood stove, I found my mind wandering back to the heavy, comforting scent of cedarwood and faint peppermint. I realized with a quiet, undeniable ache that true autonomy did not mean permanently isolating yourself from the world. It simply meant having the inherent right to choose who you allowed through your front door. I missed the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. I missed the way his massive frame made the air in any room feel instantly anchored and secure. I had successfully fled the transactional safety of his wealth, reclaiming my dignity and proving I could survive on my own. But I had not stopped thinking about the man who had willingly knelt in the cold mud just to help me carry a basket of wild herbs. On a quiet evening later that month, the coastal sky broke open, unleashing a heavy, driving rainstorm that hammered violently against the thin tin roof of the cottage. I was standing in the tiny kitchenette, wearing an oversized, faded gray sweater over my jeans, waiting for a battered tin kettle to boil over a single gas burner. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was a comforting, isolating sound, wrapping the small house in a thick cocoon of white noise. Then, I heard it, a distinct, heavy knock at the front door. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. The sound was not aggressive or demanding, but it possessed a solid, unyielding weight that cut cleanly through the chaotic noise of the storm. I slowly set down the chipped ceramic mug I had been holding. I walked across the small worn rug, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and unlocked the heavy iron deadbolt. I pulled the wooden door open. Julian Vance stood on my creaking porch. He had not brought a fleet of black SUVs. There was no private security detail sweeping the perimeter, no personal assistant waiting in the wings with an umbrella. The untouchable, ruthless tycoon had arrived completely alone. He was not wearing a bespoke charcoal suit or an expensive, tailored wool overcoat. He wore a simple, dark, water-resistant jacket and faded denim jeans. The heavy rain dripped steadily from the dark strands of his hair, running down the sharp, exhausted angles of his face. He looked entirely out of place on my sagging wooden porch, a powerful emperor standing at the very edge of a rustic, forgotten world. Yet, he did not step over the threshold. He did not push his way inside and demand that his legal, purchased wife return to the massive stone fortress he had built for her. He respected the physical boundary of the doorway, keeping his large hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, waiting patiently in the freezing downpour for my explicit permission to exist in my space. "You didn't send your security team," I whispered, the cold wind blowing a fine mist of rain across my face. "You specifically asked me not to," Julian replied. His words carried a profound, soothing timbre that instantly warmed the freezing air between us, a sound I had desperately missed. "You said you needed to breathe air. You authorized yourself. I am not here to pull you back into my world, Clara. I came to ask if there was any room for me in yours." The sheer, astonishing humility of his words stripped away the very last remaining defenses around my guarded heart. The man who ruthlessly controlled global markets, the billionaire who had been meticulously taught to view every human interaction as a calculated acquisition, was standing in the freezing rain, yielding all of his immense power just for the chance to step into my modest, unpolished life. I took a step back, opening the door wider. "It's cold out there. Come in." Julian exhaled, a long, shaky breath that betrayed the profound, quiet anxiety he had been hiding behind his stoic mask. He stepped over the threshold, ducking his head slightly to clear the low wooden doorframe. He brought the scent of rain, damp earth, and clean timber into the small cottage, instantly making the room feel infinitely safer and entirely whole. He carefully wiped his wet boots on the cheap woven mat, treating my worn floorboards with more reverence and respect than he had ever shown the imported marble of his own ancestral estate. I closed the door, sealing out the violent storm. "I don't have chamomile," I murmured, suddenly hyper-aware of the rustic poverty of my surroundings, compared to the staggering luxury he was accustomed to. "I only have cheap black tea. And the mugs are chipped." "I don't care about the tea, Clara," he said softly, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He reached into the inner pocket of his damp jacket. He did not pull out a new legal document, a bank statement, or a velvet jewelry box containing heavy diamonds. He pulled out a small worn leather journal. The edges of the thick paper were slightly curled from the damp coastal air. He held it out to me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out, my fingers brushing against his warm, rough knuckles as I took the book. I opened it to the very first page. It wasn't a printed contract dictated by corporate lawyers. It was handwritten, penned in dark, bold ink that pressed deeply and deliberately into the paper. He had penned a new set of terms. The first line promised that he would never use his wealth to build a wall between us, nor would he use it to make me feel small. The second line stated that my mother's medical care was a permanent, unconditional reality, never to be used as leverage or a debt to be repaid. The third vowed that he would never ask me to wear another woman's clothes or speak another woman's empty words, and the final line simply read, "This marriage is no longer a transaction. It is a choice. You hold the pen." I traced the heavy, deeply indented ink with my trembling fingertips. The letters blurred as a sudden, unfamiliar heat stung the corners of my eyes. He had completely dismantled the entire foundation of our transactional arrangement, stripping away the cold, clinical mechanics of debt and obligation, leaving only a raw, profound, and terrifyingly beautiful vulnerability. "Write the life you want. I'll meet you there," Julian whispered, the quiet words carrying the immense weight of an absolute, lifelong vow. He closed the physical distance between us, his massive frame towering over me in the dim, flickering light of the kitchenette. He didn't demand an answer. He simply reached out and gently rested his calloused hands on my shoulders, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of my collarbone through the faded cotton sweater. I looked up into his dark, searching eyes. The stoic, trauma-walled protector had finally dropped his heavy shield, completely surrendering his pride to a woman who had arrived in his life with nothing but a torn dress and a fierce refusal to disappear. I didn't need to sign a new document to validate what we had found. The proof was already written in the quiet respect he showed for my absolute boundaries, in the ruined, muddy knees of his bespoke trousers in the garden, and in the way he stood in my tiny, drafty kitchen, looking at me as if I were the absolute center of the universe. I reached up, wrapping my hands around his thick wrists. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the center of his chest. I felt his arms instantly wrap around me, pulling me securely against his warm, solid body. He buried his face in my hair, exhaling a deep, shuddering sigh of absolute relief. We didn't speak another word. We didn't need to. We stood in the center of the small stone cottage, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the tin roof and the steady, grounding heartbeat of the man holding me. The cold, sterile cathedral and the towering ancestral estate felt like a lifetime away. I had willingly walked away from a billionaire's massive fortune, only to find something infinitely more valuable waiting for me in the rain. And every now and then, when the house settles in the stillness of the evening, I sit by the window with a chipped mug of black tea in my lap and look at the man sitting quietly across from me. Not because I need to guard myself against the world, but because I finally have a home worth staying in. The man who once demanded a contract now brings me that tea in the quiet of the morning. If this story doesn't rush, if it lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken, please take a moment to give it a like and subscribe to our channel.